Hello and welcome to our webinar today, which is an overview on educational visits, health and safety legislation and regulations. My name is Melanie Blackmore and I'm the Innovation Director at Edutrips. And I'm going to be taking you through this webinar today, which will cover criminal and civil law, which legislation and regulations are relevant to educational visits. And we'll also go through some key considerations that have been recommended for host country legislation. And finally, we'll review the Educational Visit Standard, BS 8848. In England and Wales, there are two types of law that may come into play following an accident or an incident on an activity or visit. And this is criminal and/or civil law. Criminal law is about society punishing an offender for committing an offence, which could arise from not meeting their legal duty. Sanctions can include fines, community penalties, and imprisonment. Whereas civil law is about compensating a victim for loss, injury, or damage caused by another party. If a case is successful, the court will award an amount of money, which is often paid by the defendant's insurance policies. And following an accident or an incident, it's possible that there could be a criminal investigation by the police and/or the Health and Safety Executive, the HSE. So what is the relevant legislation in relation to school trips? The key legislation in the UK is the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. The Act covers various clauses that affect school trips. And the Act requires employers to ensure the health and safety of their employees and non-employees, i.e. students, so far as is reasonably practicable. And the Act also places duties on individuals to take care for the health and safety of themselves and others. There are other legislative acts that are applicable as well, which includes the Activity Centres, or the Young Persons Safety Act 1995, along with the Children's Act and Childcare Act. And these are both designed for the care and support of children. So what are the relevant regulations that affect school trips? Well, the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 is supplemented by regulations which make the general requirements more explicit. Some of these key regulations include the Management of Health and Safety Regulations 1999, which requires employers to undertake risk assessments and to put measures in place to control the significant risks. Following the Lyme Bay tragedy in 1993, Parliament passed the Young Persons Safety Act in 1995. And this established the Adventure Activities Licence Authority, the AALA, making it a legal requirement for certain providers to be licensed for certain activities. For example, water sports, caving, climbing and trekking. Then the other key regulation is the Package Travel, Package Holidays and Package Tour Regulations 1992. Now, not many schools and colleges are really familiar with this because it's seen as a type of holiday regulation that they think might not be applicable to them. But it does apply. It applies if at least two of the following are applicable on a trip that you've organised, which can include transport, accommodation, and another activity. So, for example, if you were organising a ski trip and you organise the flights for the students, you organise the accommodation separately, and then you also organise the activity, so the skiing lessons, for example. Because you've actually organised all three elements, then the package tour regs will apply. But it would also apply even if you only organise 2 of those elements. So it's definitely a worthwhile consideration. Then in more recent years, the non-delegable duty of care has been introduced. So in October 2013, the UK Supreme Court ruled that in particular circumstances, schools and other public bodies have a non-delegable duty of care. So that this is an exception to the normal fault-based principles of law that we've been used to in the past, which basically means that in particular circumstances, schools and other organisations are liable to be sued for the negligence of a third party. So what that means is that ultimately it's the school's responsibility, but it could be a third party that's at fault. But if it was, say, for example, swimming lessons on the school grounds, and it's a third party that's facilitating those swimming lessons, and if there was a particular issue with a child, then it could mean that the actual school would be liable, not the third party. So who has legal responsibility for school trips? And can this be delegated? Well, the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 places overall responsibility for health and safety with the employer. In many cases, the employer will be the local authority. But in other cases, for example, an independent school, it will be the governing body or the proprietor of the school. The employer has the overall legal responsibility and, most importantly, the accountability for the health, safety and welfare of the school staff and for the health and safety of pupils, its visitors and volunteers. But can other health and safety functions and responsibilities be delegated? Well, yes, they can, but these individuals wouldn't be accountable. So these functions can be delegated to members of staff within the school to fulfil specific health and safety responsibilities on behalf of the employer. For example, running a school trip, completing a risk assessment. But it's implied that when teachers are organising and taking part in school visits off-site, that they accept responsibility for the care and welfare of pupils as they're acting in loco parentis. So they will also have duties as employees and or managers under the Health and Safety at Work legislation. So can the HSE, the Health Safety Executive, enforce compliance on overseas trips? Well, in short, the answer is no. Any incident occurring overseas is actually outside the HSE's jurisdiction, and the HSE will not investigate or take action in relation to the actual circumstances of the incident itself. Whether criminal charges should arise from such incidents would be a matter for the relevant national authorities to consider and pursue. And later on in this webinar, I'll be going through some of those key considerations when travelling overseas and what you should be taking into consideration in relation to things like travelling with minors, consumption of alcohol, religious considerations, etc. And some countries may allow parents and other parties to institute civil actions or private prosecutions following a death or injury. But the HSE can consider any circumstances relating to activities carried out in this country which may reveal systematic failings in the management of school trips. So this could be where the management are particularly weak in relation to risk management and not ensuring that risk assessments are completed properly or not completed at all. Or it may be that there's a lack of competence and training for staff in relation to health and safety when travelling on school trips. So do teachers running educational visits need qualifications or safety training? Well, there isn't a mandatory requirement for teachers to have this, and it's not actually covered in a PGC qualification, bizarrely, but it is recommended that teachers have an EVC qualification by attending an Educational Visitors Coordinators course, as this provides the basic knowledge that is required when organising educational visits. But employers must be satisfied that their teachers and staff are competent to lead or supervise a visit. And it is a legal requirement that leaders are competent for the activities that they are actually leading. Okay, so for example, on adventurous activities, which could be canoeing, for example, or sailing, leaders with specialist skills and qualifications will be needed for the activity elements of the trip. But it could be accepted that a teacher has general responsibility for the trip, but not for the specific adventurous activities. So I mentioned earlier about host country legislation. Now, obviously, we're not going to provide a list of all the legislation in all the countries in the world, and we're not going to have a standard in the UK that can help us to identify all of those. But what we can do is take into consideration some of the elements that could potentially be slightly different in those host countries that could vary from ours and what we're used to in the UK. Now, the information that you can see on this screen is provided from the British Standard BS 8848, which is the British standard for organising trips safely overseas. And it's recommended that schools and colleges ascertain the laws of the host country and the venture provider. So that's obviously, in this particular case, it could be an EVC if it's an organiser in this country, but it could also be the in-country activity specialists or holiday provider. They should be liaising with the embassies and police, if necessary, of the host country to identify what the requirements are. Okay, and ideally, if you've got somebody within that country that can share that information with you, then obviously that's advantageous, because you don't want to get caught out in an embarrassing situation, or even worse, if the students could be harmed, or if the staff could be in danger through lack of awareness or knowledge of local cultures and legislation, etc. So as we can see here, there are various considerations, including driving. I mean, this could relate to seatbelts, consumption of alcohol, so in terms of age limits or whether alcohol has been banned at all. And obviously this is for considerations for over 18-year-olds in the UK. But also other elements that need to be taken into consideration in relation to drugs and qualifications of particular activity specialists. Other considerations include the possession and administration of medicine, and also about the purchasing and the bringing home of any souvenirs from those countries. And finally, one other consideration is about crossing international borders with children, and to see what controls are in place there. Okay, so they're just a few of the considerations. So I mentioned briefly about BS 8848, and I thought I'd just spend a few moments just explaining a little bit more about the standard, because this is the only British standard for organising trips safely. So this standard was created by leading professionals to raise quality and health and safety standards of trips. And those leading professionals included the Royal Geographical Society, ABTA, IATA, education providers, and amongst other organisations as well, such as the Girl Guiding Association. So what happened was that these professionals came together to identify what the potential risks and weaknesses were when organising trips, and to provide a best practice framework for mitigating the risk. And it's not about wrapping young people up in cotton wool, it's about encouraging them to go on these trips, but to do so ideally in a safe environment. So this standard was produced partly as a result of a British Standards Institution survey that was carried out. So that was a consumer survey that was carried out across Britain, and it actually found that many parents had concerns about their children participating in educational visits abroad, and that they would like a national safety standard to be established. Now, the standard isn't mandatory, okay? It's a specification. So it could be certified at a later stage by a UCAS accredited certification body, but at this stage, it's just a voluntary standard that businesses such as charities like Raleigh International, for example, are complying with. And although this standard was written for visits overseas, what we found when we developed Edutrips, which is our online trip management system, we wanted to create it in compliance with BS 8848, is that the clauses are just as applicable to trips in the UK as they are overseas. And so that's what, if a best practice framework has been adopted, why not use it in the UK? And that's ultimately what we've done. And a copy of the standard is available for you to purchase online from BSI if you're interested in that. Or we're actually producing a webinar on it in about a month's time to expand on BS 8848. Now, obviously, that webinar will cover that in more detail, but just to give you an overview on what it covers. And it covers everything from the initial identification of the purpose of the trip. So what are the potential learning outcomes of that activity? And obviously you can link that with curriculum requirements. The planning and permission also covers finance and integrity of the trip. Making sure that you've got the relevant participant information, contact details, medical information, for example. Also ensuring that you've got a competent and qualified trip leader, and that the leadership team are aware of their roles and responsibilities, in addition to any other support members of the team. It gives guidance and support on the in-country representative and what their roles and responsibilities are. And although it doesn't stipulate what the staffing ratio should be, because obviously it depends on the students that are taking part in the activity, the type of activity, the conditions and the locations, etc., it does provide some general guidance. And it also refers to, for example, governing body guidance on specific activities on ratios, which is a useful source of information. What we've also found to be quite helpful is the actual definition of what is direct and indirect supervision, what is personal time and downtime. So for the first time, there is a very, very clear definition on these levels of supervision, which is really important when organising a trip, when obviously those students out with you 24/7, there will be time when they're sleeping or supposed to be sleeping. And it's important that they're aware of risks, and parents are, and it's about managing that risk effectively. And again, it's not about wrapping children up in cotton wool, it's about making sure that they enjoy and make the most of their trips. But it's important that we are very clear on the itinerary as to how their time is being spent. Okay. So I won't go through all of these elements because ultimately this is going into the BS 8848 webinar that I'll be recording over the next month or so. But obviously other key considerations include third-party providers, making sure that you've got their insurance details, their health and safety policy and method statements. So if there was an incident, that you can basically stipulate that you have taken necessary precautions to identify that they have addressed risk associated with their activities and services provided. Obviously, legal framework and contractual insurance information, travel, accommodation and equipment, recommendations, security and contingency planning, including incident and emergency planning. And finally, which is something that not many schools and colleges do, is to actually review how effective the trip was. Did it meet its learning deliverables? Was it an enjoyable trip? Would you use those providers again? What would you do differently? They're all really useful for planning the next trip. So the webinar today has been provided from sourcing information from all sorts of different websites and papers and standards and legislation. And I've listed a few of them here for you. I definitely recommend looking at the Outdoor Education Advisors Panel information, and also other documents and sources of reference, such as Learning Outside the Classroom, which we haven't really touched on. But this is all really useful information. And of course, the Department for Education document, which was published a couple of years ago. So it's always useful to be able to identify what the applicable legislation regulation is. And this is one of our documents that we use within our Edutrips system as a source of reference. And it's just got some examples here on some of the applicable legislation. So it's useful to share this with teachers, headmasters, headmistresses, deputies, bursars, governors, so that they are aware of the legal requirements. This is summarised by type, a link to the actual compliance obligation, and any supporting guidance, which is here. A very brief summary on the purpose and impact. So here we're looking specifically at Section 7 and 8 of the Health and Safety in Work Act and what that actually covers. And also we have evaluation of compliance. Now, this isn't a requirement of our Edutrips system, but it's really useful to use this audit tool, really. I mean, if you're identifying all the applicable legislation, why not check to see that you're actually complying with it? So this is a useful audit tool to check compliance against all the applicable legislation and also regulations as well. And again, here are a few examples. And so obviously you can add to this list. I mean, one that isn't on here, which obviously is a common requirement, is a DBS. So, the vetting and disclosure and barring service checks. So I'd recommend including a link to the national guidance on DBS here, because obviously that needs to be taken into consideration for the planning of trips and also exchange visits as well. So it's quite a useful tool to be able to review and update, monitor and measure compliance against that. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Although I've only provided a brief overview of the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, I hope that you found this webinar useful. If you'd like to discuss any aspect of the webinar that I've touched on briefly here today, and if you'd like to discuss it in further detail on how Edutrips can support compliance to these requirements, then I'd be delighted to speak to you, either in person or by phone my email address is also here, so feel free to just drop us a line and we'll be happy to help. Thank you very much for listening.